what makes America great is not its power so much as its morality, its sense of moral purpose. The thing about aspirations, they don't always have to be met to be real. A lot of people are downcast about the American model and don't feel very good about their country. So if I can tell, especially young Americans, progressives, fellow Arabs and Muslims, the people who are most likely to lose faith, if I can convince them to regain some of their faith, that would be a huge win.
So welcome to the Hope Axis, Shadi Hamid. This is, I don't know how much you know about the podcast or how much you can discern this from the title, but we will talk about hope here. And I'm very glad that you're here. I feel like you're one of the kind of most obvious guests to come on. I think every time you and I have a conversation, whether that's during an internet salon, offline or online, or just like we're, exchanging thoughts via text, we always somehow end up talking about hope. I feel like for you and me, this is a huge overlap in our thinking, in how we see the world structured, what we expect from politics, what we expect from intellectuals, hope, hopelessness, and how to deal with these two things. They seem to be at the core of our thinking. So you're in the right place for this. And you have a new book, The Case for American Power. I have an advanced copy. Those of us watching, those of you watching us on video will see that this is a beautiful cover. I dressed up to match it. This is the red, white, and blue is there. So congratulations. It has not
Thank you.
come out yet, but we will do some spoilers.
Okay.
Sounds good. Okay, so first of all, to kind of like come out with this right away, I feel like whilst reading this book, I had to update my opinion about you, and now I'm kind of suspicious that you might be an optimist. Do you want to talk about it? This was not at all obvious in the big black book that is The Problem of Democracy, but here are we, what happened? Did you do an ayahuasca trip? Are you in love? What's going on? Something happened in American politics that changed your mind? What's going on?
That's actually really funny you'd say that. So you thought I was a pessimist before?
Yeah. No, I'm an Eastern European, so I thought you were a realist.
Yeah, huh. Well, that's a good sign, actually. It means maybe something different came out while I was writing this book, and maybe even something I didn't totally expect. And maybe it was part of my effort. I really wanted to hope. And part of this book is in part a love letter to America, despite all of its faults. So maybe just being in the mode of trying to find the best in my country and trying to remind myself of that more optimistic streak within me came out, even if I didn't fully intend it to. That's really great to hear, actually.
So you started out with the explicit ambition to write a really tragic, sad book, and somehow midway, the sun was shining and the birds were singing in Washington, D.C. You looked outside your apartment and thought, well, maybe there's hope.
Well, what's interesting is that I started writing it before October 7th, and then I wrote parts of it after October 7th and revised. And I was reckoning with Gaza and what that meant for my argument. So if anything, there would have been a real risk of becoming more and more pessimistic as time went on. I mean, also Donald Trump was elected, and for me, that wasn't a great thing. And everything about our politics has darkened, even as I was making the final edits to the book a few months ago. But so that means that I was able to resist the urge to really darken it or to maybe make it less optimistic. I was able to maintain that tone. That's good. I want this book to be a hopeful one. Otherwise, what would be the point? I mean, it is called The Case for American Power. It's making an affirmative case for something that I think is good, or at least better than the alternatives are. So I want people to come out of this with a sense of, if they can be made to believe in America and fight for America in a way they weren't before, that would be a huge success. I mean, that's part of why I wrote it. and we can delve into that more of why I think people need to hear that argument now. But obviously, a lot of people are downcast about the American model and don't feel very good about their country. So if I can tell, especially young Americans, progressives, fellow Arabs and Muslims, the people who are most likely to lose faith, if I can convince them to regain some of their faith, that would be a huge win.
So during one Interact salon, you shocked participants by identifying as being on the left. I think that's what people immediately left the salon. I'm joking. I'm joking, dear audience. This is not. It was a very jokey and loving conversational environment. But it's not really one of the most popular theses on the American left, whether that's closer to the center or farther away, that we should go back to maybe an earlier incarnation of bold, that like liberal democracy representative international power in the shape of how America gets involved. And I would imagine that for you, and you're quite open about this, the Gaza events greatly complicated the picture. I mean, it wasn't a time, based on your columns at the time at the Washington Post, based on your tweets, based on your posts through Wisdom of Crowds, and also in this book, that wasn't the time for you when you were like, fuck yeah, America, do what you always do. It was a moral crisis. So I'm really curious how you ended up in this kind of cauldron that any moral crisis is, where we kind of like revise our previous opinions, we realign, our alliances, and somehow that led you out toward the argument that America should get more involved and not less. So do you want to maybe just guide us through that thinking? This can be a therapy session, for you, but I think that's
That
such an
sounds.
interesting intellectual journey.
I appreciate that. Well, first of all, I am of the left, and I think I'm on the left. Although you're right that when we did that inter-intellect salon a couple years ago, I think that maybe at that time I was more associated with the anti-woke portion of the American public debate. And that's coded as being on the right or right of center and that sort of thing. Now that we've largely moved away from that whole period, where now wokeness is not the primary enemy, and it almost seems like a lot of that was overwrought. We were so obsessed about wokeness, but now wokeness has been defeated. And it's sort of like, were we really right to focus so much on that and to become obsessed with that? But that's a little bit of a tangent. I mean, as I discussed in the book, I mean, I came of age post 9/11. I was an anti-war activist. This is in relation to the Iraq War. So I was the kind of person who was organizing teach-ins, die-ins. We actually did, and actually a tent-in as well. We had an encampment, a small encampment on Georgetown's campus during the full duration of the war. We had a presence in the main square at Georgetown, which is ironically called Red Square. And and so I see that as my intellectual pedigree. I was someone like a lot of people were in their undergraduate days, reading Noam Chomsky. He was my foreign policy guru. And at that time, it was always about blaming America first. America was the font of evil. America was always wreaking havoc and destruction throughout the world. And I think that America still does sometimes wreak havoc and destruction in the world. And that brings us to Gaza, that my alliances shifted and I became more progressive after October 7th. I saw Gaza as the number one moral issue of our time. And for me, it was a real reckoning. And to see how my fellow comrades on the anti-woke side of things, most of them became pretty hard, or already were, hardline pro-Israel. So I had a kind of divergence with them. And then I felt more comfortable again in progressive spaces. because we were aligned on the issue that was front of mind for me as I was writing my columns and as I was thinking about America's place in the world. It was sort of like Gaza changes a lot, but also it didn't change everything. And that's why I could still write the book. I mean, there was a period when I was writing the book post October 7th when I wondered, do I really want to make this argument to people? Do I really feel comfortable making the case for American power while America is facilitating what I considered what I consider to be a genocide? That's a hard one to take on. And this isn't just the kind of thing where America was turning a blind eye to Israel. We were actively facilitating the war through weapons and military aid. So that kind of makes us more directly complicit. So all of that made me wonder. And I think that I came to the conclusion that this argument still needs to be made. And that in some ways, what happened in Gaza was not really an example of American power as much as it was an example of America not using its power. That we were pretty much saying we were adopting a hands-off approach to Israel, and we were abdicating our moral responsibility. To use American power in that instance would be to use our military assistance and our weapon sales to put pressure on Israel and say, hey, if you want to continue receiving support from us, maybe stop killing people as much. Like that would have been the way to use our power. And the Biden administration pretty much threw up its hands and was completely absent. Completely absent. I mean, the same can be said for Trump in the first up until the ceasefire, but at least Trump ultimately was able to bring pressure to bear on Israel and bring an end to the war, even though it's not fully an end, but at least it's better than what it was before. At least we have, some halt in the killing. So anyway, it's just to say that I think that ultimately American power is still what we need. American power was the only way to end the war, and Donald Trump used American power to have the ceasefire that we're currently living under, as flawed as it might be.
Talk to me a little bit about this idea that I think you so beautifully and repeatedly expressed kind of late 2023, early 2024, that Gaza was the core moral issue of our time. We know from the news, from friends, from our own lives that, probably a lot of students around America would agree with you. We also know which would be the newspapers where the people in leadership positions would not agree with you. What do you mean by this? And other than, Trump openly adopting this kind of strongman side of American international policy, is that the only main change that you're observing, or did that moral crisis that we went through cause like a more general shift?
Well, we're still in that moral crisis for sure. And I still feel a little bit reticent when I'm talking about the book with certain people. There have been times where I've been in social gatherings, especially with Arabs and Muslims, where they'll ask me what I'm doing and what I'm working on, and I'll say that I have a book coming out and then part of me almost doesn't want to say what the title is because I'm worried that it will provoke an argument or it'll change the way they view me. Because they'll be like, wait, Shadi, we've been reading your columns that have been so strong on Gaza, and now you're writing an entire book called The Case for American Power. Are we misunderstanding who you are? And so I have been sometimes uncomfortable. But you know what? As a
This is
writer,
kind of the Zadie Smith observation that in the time of the internet, every statement is ad hominem. Like you are, you can't update because then your entire identity changes.
Yeah, they would see me differently. And I guess I don't want to say I'm a people pleaser, but I like people to like me sometimes, especially in social settings. And I don't want to be that guy where people are like, oh, he's a sellout, or he's some kind of like Arab native informant, or whatever it might be. So I always have to explain to people, guys, don't get the wrong idea. Let me explain what this book is about. So I can do that, and I'm more than happy to do that and to sort of articulate the nuances. Why is Gaza the moral
You are
issue
not
of our
tempted to call it the complicated case for American power or like add some kind of a, modifier there.
I could have done the case for American power, comma, despite all of its faults or something like that, but that wouldn't be catchy. Um, but I mean, we did think about different titles, and there were other options and other things that we could have emphasized, but I think this was the right choice after discussing it with the publisher. We wanted to have the argument right there in the title. Let me own it. Let me not do this kind of like half-hearted, you don't want to, that's not going to work. And I feel better now because now I'm ready. I'm ready to lay this out. And I want people to listen to it. I think in some ways, not to self-aggrandize too much here, I was going to say in some ways it's my magnum opus. But all I mean by that, I think it's a culmination of 15 years of my life, really. I've been
Your
thinking,
manifesto.
yeah, manifesto of sorts. And I want people to read it as a manifesto if they can kind of have a little copy with, in their apartment and to kind of remind themselves every couple years of why America is great. That would really be a nice thing to know if that's
More
in
coming
fact
from you, right? It means something more because
yeah,
it's
because
from
I'm
a
a critic,
place
exactly.
of a
Because I'm
critical
of the left,
thinker.
I'm a critic of I'm in some ways I'm a critic of American power. In some
Yes.
ways, I'm very critical of what America is today
We're
in different aspects. I'm a child of immigrants. I'm brown. I'm Muslim. For me to make this argument is different than some neocon to make it.
yes. But it's also
So
like
I hope,
there's a dialectical Oedipal side to it that the Central European me greatly enjoys, right?
yeah,
Because, of course, when we're young, for whatever reason, Chomsky is our god in terms of public policy and anarcho-syndicalism, except when you study linguistics like myself, because then he's like the stuff of nightmares for you for many years. And then, the father is to blame for everything, right? America, the Lord is bad. You rebel, you distance yourself. And then there is a kind of dialectic of arriving back to the starting point and getting more actively involved and saying, okay, but if I actually can express my own ideology here, if I can add my own faith to this, could we cooperate somehow? Like, what is American power without
yeah.
Americans in this sense, right? So you do this thing of like, if this is a thing that's happening, I might as well add my voice or be active in it.
Yeah, American power is just a fact. It's inevitable. It's not going away anytime soon. I'm not someone who believes that we're going to be supplanted by China in the next 5 or 10 years. And I make a case against that, and I lay out all the reasons why China's rise is overstated, sometimes wildly overstated. And I think it's a sign of a kind of self-loathing that we're so prone to this kind of discourse around China's greatness. It's almost like we want to put ourselves down and raise them above us, which I think is a very odd thing to do if you're American. If you're American, you should love your country and want it to be the best. You should want it to be number one. As like jingoistic or overly patriotic as that might sound, there's really no shame in loving one's country and wanting the best for it. So can you imagine a lot of Chinese people like thinking to themselves, "Oh, China sucks so much. We're evil." I mean, maybe a minority of Chinese people think that, but generally, I think in most countries in the world, people are like, if you're Egyptian, you're like, "Oh, I feel pretty good about being Egyptian," even though Egypt is a bit of a joke on the, in various ways. It's something, it's sort of like we use the analogy of the father or the mother or children. You're going to love your child even if your child is a fuck up, right? And even if unless your father or mother have done something really, really awful to you, even if they're flawed, which most parents are ultimately, you're still going to feel like a kind of ownership over them. They're my parents. Other people, I can criticize them, but I don't want other people to criticize them all that much. So I think there's this sense of, there's actually a word for it in Arabic. I'm trying to think of what an English word for it would be, where it's this
What is it
sense
in
of,
Arabic?
um, I'm actually blanking. I know what the, I know, I have the word on the tip of my
Yeah.
tongue, but but
I
it
have this
is,
with Hungarian words all the time.
yeah,
There are some
but
such good words, and like they have no equivalent in any other
yeah,
language.
it's this concept of wanting to defend something and to feel, yeah, to feel ownership, to feel like it's yours, that you want to defend its honor. Yes,
But
that's maybe a little bit better. That you want to defend your country's honor.
because about you, right? Like you are like there's a kind of syllogistic relationship here that America is Americans. I am an American, therefore
Or
it's like it's very personal. So your moral formation post Gaza has been to be as critical as you've ever been ever in your life about America, right? There is the core moral catastrophe of our times. It really makes you come like unmediatedly close to this problem. And there you realize that actually, oh, actually, I'm a patriot. I want America.
yeah,
I'm all, okay.
that's very well put. I mean, it's also quite personal for me in certain ways, the Gaza aspect of it, where there are friendships that have been strained. There are people that I don't really talk to any longer. It feels like this is the one thing, like I'm able to talk to Trump supporters, and I've really taken pride in my own work that I'm always able to debate across ideological and partisan lines. But on this, because I think it speaks to a kind of disregard for Muslim and Arab life in a way that feels very personal to me. If you don't see Palestinians as human beings, if you're able to excuse away what Israel is doing just by saying, oh, Hamas has tunnels, as if that abdicates Israel of any moral agency and moral responsibility, it's a very, for me, it means that you prioritize other things over human lives that I associate with. They look like me. They they speak at least one of the languages that I speak. They are the vast majority of them Muslim. And I think there is this sense that Muslims are just that they represent, they're sort of that Israel is this kind of Western liberal outpost in a sea of Arab barbarism. There's a kind of civilizational language that is used to demean the experience of Gazans and the Palestinian people. Like they are just not good enough, and Israel has no choice but to kill them. That's almost even worse. I wish people would have just be straight up about it, but to act as if Israel was compelled to do this, there's something dark about that. It's almost hard for me to fathom or express. Anyway, there's more to be said on that, but just to say that
But like deeply
it,
antithetical to the humanist tradition in American Enlightenment and American liberal democracy, right?
yeah, it
Because
claims
I
to
mean,
be
this whole
liberal.
place is based on actual texts that are preserved in the famous libraries of the country, and you can read them, right? Like this is a place that where the word became a man, literally. Those are the Americans,
Yes,
and that is kind of grounded on these extremely humanistic notions. And so if you say something whereby it sounds like you're favoring one group of people over another, that's
yes.
like it violates the humanistic tradition in America.
Well, very well said. Yeah,
Even the
there's
Christian one,
some,
like if we posit that this is a Christian country fundamentally, which is another whole other argument, but it is also antithetical to Christian values.
yeah, there is something, yes, very Christian and also very American about seeing human beings as being made in the image of God, and that they are all deserving of dignity, even if they've made bad political choices, even if they've made mistakes in their struggle for independence or nationhood. Because that's what people often do. They'll say Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, and they could have taken all these offers and done this and X, Y, and Z. I disagree with a lot of those accounts, but even if you take them as accurate, that doesn't mean they're any less human. And there is this tendency towards speaking about Palestinians in this language of collective punishment because their leaders have made bad decisions. Therefore, they have to pay the price for the decisions their leaders made. And I think all of this is very much against the American ethic, the American sense of solidarity with people who are struggling for their own freedom. And I don't mean, and it's not the woke thing. Obviously, I think there's something in the American story about sympathy for those who are in their own struggle for liberation. I mean, that's one of the reasons that in the 1960s, for example, during these independence struggles throughout the world, the British were seen as the primary enemy. People identified more with America because we had our revolution.
Yeah.
We had to kind of free ourselves from the yoke of British imperialism. So there is something in the American story that is very resonant to peoples who are trying to liberate themselves from outside occupation or imperial control.
And you argue in the program, I mean, this is the whole, if I understand correctly, and I loved that book. And I remember spending a dinner when I just tried to convince you to start writing novels, spy novels. I don't know if
Yeah. Oh,
you remember
yeah.
this. I think
I
I
do remember
talked
that.
about it for like 4 hours without anybody asking or encouraging me, as one does, that I think based on that book that you should start writing like John le Carré books, basically, because you have so much time. But basically the whole point of the book that you were making throughout is that the American ideal of helping other people fight for their freedom is extremely discriminatory, and it's a little bit like, oh, freedom for thee, but not for thee. And so in this case, for you, the events surrounding October 7th kind of rhyme with your earlier, like maybe the sense was a little bit, not prophetic, but at least intuiting that this is where this is going. That
Wow,
there
I like
might be
that.
a group
Yeah.
that is not allowed to liberate itself if for that group in their own value system, what liberation is doesn't fully correspond to the American ideal of or America's illusion about the place.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's animated me from a young age. And I mean, one thing I talk about actually probably in both books to some extent is growing up and spending summers in Egypt and seeing how I couldn't understand this was an American ally, supposedly. We gave them billions of dollars of aid every year, yet there was a dictator in charge in Egypt. And I was like, how are we allowing this to happen? How is it that we claim to support democracy in theory, but we end up supporting these dictators in practice, but we don't support them everywhere? We support them primarily in the Middle East. The Middle East is exceptional. There's something about Arabs that makes
Now,
them,
right? But back in the day, South America had very similar
yeah, yeah,
problems,
certainly
like
during the Cold
fascist
War.
communists. Like the Americans were very, suddenly very tolerant of certain types of oppression.
Exactly. But after the Cold War, we start to get better in Latin America, Asia, Africa. We facilitate democratic transitions there. And of course, in Eastern Europe, the one region that we don't so try to support democracy is in the Middle East. And that's where we stay with the old policies. And that really hurt. And it meant that Arabs were undeserving of the things that other people deserved. And that to me has always been a great moral outrage. And it's that moral outrage that I think animates a lot of my work.
And I think it's important for our listeners and viewers to understand that in our circles, which is this kind of not the top of the kind of intellectual elite in America, but like the aspirant class in the media, in the startup world, your ideas are quite unpopular in like the interpersonal sense. Like I really respect that you're still like, guys, I have to be intellectually honest here, and you are wrong. And I think people don't understand how contrarian this is. I don't mean unpopular in like a social sense, but I remember being at a party in DC where you arrived and there were like two people who just got super mad. And I was like, yeah, okay, I understand that October 7th happened, but Shadi didn't do it. Like, he's a Muslim American, geopolitical expert in America. He reports from that angle of the story. Like, I want to have a public arena where people can just like represent their sides and ideals. But when it comes to Israel and when it comes to some types of American international intervention, these are extremely touchy subjects that can cost you greatly in the social sense.
I didn't know there was a party where a couple people were uncomfortable with my very
Yeah, I
presence.
told
I don't
them
know
to
if you.
fuck off. Don't worry, it's fine. But it struck me that, oh my God, I'm a foreigner here, so I observe all these little nuances that maybe come as completely, maybe tragically normal, maybe for Americans, but even for somebody with your background, it surprises people if you're, for instance, not actively calling for the protection of life in certain parts of the world.
Yeah,
It's
I
kind of
think I think
insane.
also
It looks insane, you know?
I think there was also a sense that Shadi was one of the reasonable ones. That Shadi was anti because he was anti-woke, because he wasn't too obsessed with Donald Trump. That, oh, we Shadi is the kind of guy that we can understand. But then when
Yeah.
they saw what I was saying post October 7th, they couldn't sort of square the two versions of me together. They wanted me to be something that I wasn't.
Yeah.
And
I mean, they invite you
people.
to the party, right? Like, this is like we are in the same circles, and even people who might, tangentially disagree with you will still understand that we are in the same community. But the disagreement when it comes to these, I'm sorry to say, racial and religious questions run insanely deep and are
Yeah.
even in the circles that consider themselves cosmopolitan, enlightened, whatever. And I feel like you can tell how important a moral crisis that surrounded Gaza was by how all these tribal affiliations suddenly came to
Yeah.
surface, and you couldn't lie about it anymore.
Yeah,
People basically
that's
showed
right.
you, like you said, are you comfortable with what's going on or not? The same with ICE today, right? Like, there was this picture of this woman demonstrating somewhere during a raid by ICE, and holding this sign that, if you were wondering what you would have been doing during the Holocaust or slavery, now you know.
Mm. It's intense and personal in a way that is really important to grasp. I don't want to say the personal is political, but because that's something that woke people say a lot and it can be sort of annoying. But yeah, I mean, I think we're living in
You can
times
take it
where
back. Take it back.
take it back, exactly. But we're living in times where it's hard to separate between the personal and the political because so much is at stake. It feels existential for so many of us.
But to be kind of a jerk here, what is really at stake? So, say we're at this party, an imaginary party, say we're in New York City, and half of the group really believe A and the other really believe in B. What do you think makes what do you think makes this feel like an existential question? And what do people hope in America their political opinions will lead to in the cases where the actual people that we're voting for have much more mixed opinions and behaviors?
Yeah, well, I think there are some pro-Israel American Jews who, for understandable reasons, because of the legacy of the Holocaust, they, some of them seem to feel that if the views of people like me gain more traction, then that will mean the end of Israel as they know it. I don't think that's true. I'm not someone who ever has called for the destruction of Israel. I believe in a two-state solution. I believe that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state, which sometimes makes me unpopular with some of my Palestinian friends. But but I think there is an understandable fear that there's a kind of chain of events. And if certain views become more mainstream, then it will lead to things. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's part of the argument as I understand it, a sense of real vulnerability, and that the only way for the Jewish people to survive is for Israel to be dominant, and that if Israel loses any ground, then it means that Jewish people are under threat. When I think in some ways it's actually the kind of the reverse, but that's a whole kind of different conversation. And I think that for us, and I don't love this sort of terminology of us and they and all of that, but that's how we view it. When things feel existential, it starts to become about the us
The
and
tribal.
the preservation of the us over whoever seems to be threatening
Hmm.
us. And I think for a lot of Arabs, it feels in this moment that it's open season on Arabs, whether it's their identity, whether it's the way that anti-Arab and anti-Muslim sentiment has been normalized, especially in Europe,
Hmm.
with the rise of right-wing parties that are really anti-Muslim at their core. So I think all of that creates this sense of profound vulnerability.
Hmm.
And it's understandable, but I think on both sides, but we also have to understand how the tribal sentiments can be counterproductive.
And we know from history that, pressuring or freezing out a group or making them feel threatened only like strengthens the kind of differentiating traits or the holding on to it. I mean, this is the whole I'm Jewish, and this is like our whole history. The more, persecuted Jews felt, the more, kind of solidified some of the traditions, some of the customs became, because that was the core of the identity. And so it's interesting that people who fear cultural difference, through their fear, actually create a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
And more people will be extremely religious, or more people will feel like they are not part of mainstream society. So it's very, very counterintuitive. I'm very curious, and I want to go back into the tribal question. So say, let's take a reasonable American person from Jewish origin who is pro two-state solution. What would be something that you would disagree with this person? Where would you differ?
Well, if they're a young American Jew, there's a chance that we would agree because young American Jews are more pro-Palestinian than the elder generations. You do see a real generational gap. But if someone is, say, pro-Israel, and I think we have to be very careful not to associate being Jewish with being pro-Israel. I think a lot of people want that to be the case, and they insist that one equals the other, but that I think is a mistake. But if someone is quote unquote pro-Israel and is an American Jew, I think that we would disagree on whether to call what's going on in Gaza genocide, whether to attribute war crimes to Israel. I think there's a sense that Israel can do no bad, that because Israel is so central to their identity as they see it, this is not me. I mean, they see Israel as central to their Jewishness, that if they start criticizing Israel for committing war crimes, forget even the label genocide. No one has to view it as a genocide. That's not the number one issue here. But to admit that Israel is capable of doing terrible and evil and even evil things, I think they're not able to see that a state that calls itself the Jewish state is capable of evil. And I understand why. Because if they acknowledge that, then they would have to acknowledge other things about their identity. And no one wants to undermine their own deeply rooted identity, which has been built over years, if not decades. I think that's the part that is really challenging.
You say young American Jews. So what do you mean by young? And is there a cutoff line? That's very important in terms of like the generations of the ideology, of what democracy means, what like intervention in the Middle East means, and what might be the cause.
Usually, I think it's talked about as under 35 or even sometimes Gen Z. And I think there the reason is the Holocaust doesn't have the same kind of intimate relationship in people's lives that it once did, that people are now maybe two generations removed instead of one or generation removed, that the American Jewish experience has been primarily one of success and and thriving, really, which is very different than the experience in Israel, which is one of feeling like you're under attack from all sides. So I think that when again, whether or not
Kind of
that's accurate in a
justifiably, no? Like, have you tried to drive around the Middle East, starting out from Israel? You can't really do that.
true, true.
Who isn't trying to attack Israel?
Yeah. Um, to be fair, it's hard to really drive anywhere out of a country in the Middle East because it's such a divided region. I
Right.
mean, there's I don't want to name the countries. There are Arab countries that I can't even enter because of my political views. And
Well,
anyway, but but
right.
um but I would just say, yeah, I think that.
There's a cutoff generation
Look,
based on,
yeah, yeah,
yeah. I mean,
yeah. But look,
I am a descendant of Holocaust survivors, so it's very intimate. I
yeah,
personally always think, like, is that removal good or bad? I mean, we're becoming removed from the entirety of the moral universe of the Second World War, and it's very important in for your book, right? I mean, the Second World War established basically the world order in which America is the peacekeeper, America is the good guy, the allies of America are on the good side, within which played out also the, amongst many other horrible events, the Holocaust. And being removed in terms of generations from it leaves a lot of ground for misinformation, from trivializing things that affected so many people. Or maybe, I mean, this is always my worry, coming from a more dictatorial country, that Americans not having personal experiences with this thing makes them a little bit blind to similar phenomena happening here, or processes that for me immediately red flag. And we could argue that, for instance, the Holocaust is something like this as well, that if it's part of your family lore and your identity to identify threats, then maybe even some American Jews would become a little bit maybe less suspicious of some
mm.
speech against them, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure
This
in
is
the Arabic world there's the exact equivalent, and I think this is not uniquely Jewish, but it's part of. I mean, we tell children horror stories about gingerbread houses and little girls in red hoods being eaten by wolves, because these things can happen to you, and you kind of want
yeah.
to pass down a previous generation's story of tragedy and survival to make the next generation more resilient, but also more kind of watchful.
Yeah, your point applies more broadly too. I mean, Americans are removed from the Cold War. They're removed from any real implication of what World War II was about. I mean, at the
The
conclusion of World War,
nuclear threat, right? There's a movie
exactly.
out now, and people are like, "Oh, there are nuclear weapons in the world." Yeah, duh.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, at the conclusion of World War II, only about 8% of the world's countries were democracies. By the 1990s, after the third wave of democratization, the number was around 50%. And what I argue in the book is we have to remember that at least some of this was made possible by American dominance. Like, it's not a mistake that America became the superpower, and that's also the time period in which democracies were thriving. There's been some retreat in recent years, but still, the number of overall democracies is hovering at around 50%. That is a huge victory, and we take it for granted now. It wasn't it wasn't a normal thing for a country to be democratic in the 1950s or 60s. That changed over time.
It's still super low, by the way.
Yeah, it should be a lot higher,
If
right?
you were like,
Yeah.
"Oh, already 50% of babies survive," you would be like, "That's very little."
That's terrible. Exactly.
That's
That's actually a
terrible.
really good point. I hadn't really thought of it that way. Yeah, and so one thing I talk about in the book is the I there's a term called oikophobia, which is the reverse of xenophobia. Xenophobia is the fear of the outsider or the foreigner. Oikophobia is the fear of what is familiar or what is home. So, young Americans are more prone to oikophobia. They don't feel good about who they are. There's a kind of self-loathing or even self-hatred.
My friends who
And
have kids always tell me these horror stories that they have to basically deprogram their own children because they hear all this shit in school that make no sense scientifically, technically, how the economy works. And they are just like fed often these like
yes,
American anti-progress sentiment, anti-democratic as well.
yeah, anti-Americanism is just in the air that we breathe. And that's because we don't know what it means to fight for democracy and freedom. For those who lived part of their lives during the Cold War, and you lived, I mean, the Cold War was very personal for you because you had to live under communism for a period. Yeah, yeah, you did. Right?
I mean, I
Or
was
partly. You
six years
were
old.
young, right?
It was exactly, I think I was exactly six when the Berlin Wall came down. I have very vague memories, but I mean, my grandparents were communists and they were
Yeah.
very successful in the system, often just kind of like coexisting alongside it. In the case of basically two of my grandparents, but my other two grandparents, both my grandfathers, one was an extremely accomplished economist and later on diplomat around the world. And this was a time when people couldn't, you know, leave the country. And he was like traveling around America and Canada and Africa. And the other grandfather was a film star and he was used by the regime basically in these movies
Mm,
to portray a very specific kind of like archetypal character basically. And so they were complicit in some ways and they were true believers. They believed,
mm,
and I always try to be, maybe this is why I'm always striving to understand very different like points of view, because I have to understand these gigantic dichotomies even within my own family. That there were atheists, there were religious people, there were people who just like had a religious epiphany midlife. There were people who actually believed that communism was a kind of liberation, a form of progress, that it was really about equality. And then later on, of course, they had reached their own conclusions when they gathered more information, but it was very attractive to young people, the same way as certain forms of wokeism or
yeah.
Chomsky in your case, like it's attractive when you're young and you want to blame somebody, or in my, grandparents' case, when you're like liberated from a death camp and your home city has been like bombed to rubble.
Mm,
It's, there are, and I think people who argue for the destruction of certain places in, say, the Middle East, they don't appreciate the fact that it's the biggest paradigm shift that you will cause for that population, because you kind of create this tabula rasa, and entirely new and often very noxious ideologies can also take root. Like it's the
yeah.
biggest trauma, right? You just like, there's a person, all of their family is dead, all of their entire street is gone, not just their house. Like those are not really the moments when we are the most level-headedly philosophical usually. It's very like survival mode. And I think ideologies in survival mode are very problematic. And I think your thesis in the new book is a little bit like, let's keep the good stuff. You don't want to always like redo and rebuild and destroy. There's something about basically the institution of American power in which we don't have to create these catastrophes. We can just like keep it and live with it.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a number of instances, just to state the most obvious ones, where the US has been the first or last line of defense in situations of mass slaughter. And we did talk about, ending World War II, but when we're talking about um, the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait in the first Gulf War, the Bosnian genocide, ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, I supported the intervention in Libya. That would not have been possible without the US. Libya isn't some kind of flourishing democracy now, but at least the intervention stopped the killing. I think we could have stopped the mass slaughter that was happening in Syria. in 2013 with American power. We chose not to exercise that power. And I think that's a moral stain on America's record. So we can think of very specific examples of how American power can be used for good. And when people are suffering and struggling, when they're fighting for their freedom, they don't look to China or Russia. They don't say, "Where is China coming to our
I
defense?"
don't know.
Like no one would even, it wouldn't occur to anyone to even think of that.
Nobody's ever
They,
like, don't worry, son, Russia is coming to help us.
yeah, exactly. But there is still this sense America might be able to help us. We don't know if they will,
Yeah.
but they could, they might. There's this sense that people have outside of our country that America is better than we even admit to ourselves, or at least that we're capable of being better. There is that kind of aspiration, and that aspiration survives even if it's unmet. The thing about aspirations, they don't always have to be met to be real.
Our friend Steven Pinker just published a wonderful book called Common Knowledge. And I'm so
Yep.
curious about how I was actually just about to ask you about this. So it's beautiful that you kind of like segued into it kind of naturally from your point. Like, how much is this about illusion? So say, oh, nobody says, since certain actually very complicated times in the Second World War or the First World War, that, oh, Russia is going to come and help us. Most people trust American intervention when it comes to avoiding genocide and oppression, which, you know, makes the Gazan events all the more complicated to even just, take in. So how much of this is just deterrence and people thinking that American power exists? And how do you see that? Does America have to like demonstrate it every once in a while so that people still know that daddy is there and can come and help you? And is this something that you think America can do kind of naturally as it operates outside its borders? Or is it something that you think needs an actual policy and somebody in Washington has to like have a plan that, okay, every 3 years we will bomb a little bit. Every 4 years we will get a Nobel Peace Prize. Every like 7th year, I don't know, there is a tweet storm where we greatly condemn this dictator. How do you see that? I mean, it feels like a kind of dance. There's a choreography to it, right?
It's delicate. Yeah. I mean, look, military power should be used sparingly. My book is not some neocon treatise where I'm asking for the US military to be involved everywhere. I'm actually skeptical of some of these interventions. I mean, like I said earlier, I was very much opposed to the Iraq War, and that was an important moment for me. So and also the war in Afghanistan, I was very critical of, although in different ways. So I think that no, the U.S. shouldn't have to bomb every few years, but I do think there has to be a real sense that America is serious about using its power when necessary. If we just talk a big game and use a lot of rhetoric, but then we don't act on our rhetoric, then that confuses people. And people don't know whether or not our word means something. And rhetoric sets a standard. And that's why rhetoric is important. I don't want us to do away with the rhetoric. And we've had presidents really from the beginning, from George Washington onwards, who have talked about America in the language of morality, of the fact that we have an ideological mission. And if we believe in these values here at home, which we say that we do, then we should want to share them at least with some people in other parts of the world. What I worry about with Donald Trump is that he's strong on the military rhetoric, but he has completely done away with the language of idealism, with the language of democracy and human rights abroad. And granted, we didn't live up to that rhetoric a lot of the time, but that's the thing about like what I just said about rhetoric is that it at least reminds us of who we are. It creates a set of expectations. Morality is sometimes honored in the breach. think about the people who we know who seem quite moral. They fall short a lot of the time. And nations like people are going to fall short. The US is not an NGO. It's not a human rights organization. So this idea that we can be morally pure in the exercise of our own power is just not realistic. But should there be an aspiration to being more moral and being more just? Yes, I think so.
I always worry these days that the giant amount of money that is being invested in military technology, combined with the American peace accords and kind of pulling back from the world stage, plus the way military recruitment is trying to address downward white mobility, creates this kind of determinism that will force the US, or they will force themselves to basically deploy inside the country. I mean, we're already seeing, the National Guard, ICE,
Yes.
that there's a militarization inside the country. They are using clearly certain groups as scapegoats to justify the use of force and personnel. And so that's kind of where I'm seeing a renewed danger, which actually is quite unprecedented, I think, in US history, where you're not trying to have less but more guns, not less police but more police in the country. But I mean, that's the kind of logical outcome of the current events, right?
Yeah, it's straight out of, one might say, the authoritarian playbook, the scapegoating and using one's own military forces within. Obviously, all of that is quite frightening, which is why a big chunk of my book is a reminder of what makes America great, which is not its power so much as its morality, its sense of moral purpose. If we lose sight of who we are and we become less democratic at home, then all of this is for naught. Then you can just sort of then why are we doing anything? Why do we wake up in the morning and I mean I what I try to remind myself of every day is why I'm doing this and why I write. And part of why I write is because I believe in America, and I believe in it because it's a democracy. Those two things are intertwined together. If we became more militarized at home, if we became more authoritarian at home, then we don't really have a lot to fight for abroad. These things are interlinked. So, and this is where I think I really want progressives and Democrats, and by this I mean members of the Democratic Party, to stay involved in politics. And part of the book is directed towards them. Because if they exit the political game altogether and say, we don't want to vote, we don't want to participate, we don't want to organize, then we're ceding ground to those militaristic and authoritarian elements, which I believe don't really understand what America is. They might say they do, and they talk about America first, but they don't actually get what America is about. I think it's actually oftentimes immigrants and children of immigrants who understand what America is. Because we know what the alternative is. It's not a hypothetical thing for me. My parents grew up under an authoritarian regime. I lived in authoritarian countries. Granted, I was an American citizen, so I wasn't in necessarily in the same amount of danger, but I know what it's like to feel, to realize that the country that you're living in is actually like a pretty scary one. And so I think we as children of immigrants, we have to sort of remind our fellow Americans of what this is all about.
I feel this responsibility so strongly. I mean, running Interact and just constantly talking about the fact that, guys, if you lose the very mechanisms that make liberal democracy possible, it's going to become impossible. Like it is coming,
Yeah.
those liberties are coming from somewhere, and you can't just undo all those, processes, because then the next generation of that freedom is just not going to be there. It's not guaranteed. It's not a given. It's not a natural phenomenon. It comes from these, the mechanisms in politics and institutions and in how people think as well, in their moral expectations. We have a little bit of time left, and I would love to talk about something that I think in your case is of exceptionally great interest for understanding you, for understanding the book. And that is, where were you? We all remember where we were on 9/11. It's one of the questions that will bring together any two people in the world in a positive or negative way. It is responsible for some of the generational divides when it comes to foreign policy expectations. It's responsible for the strength of your experiences with regard to Islamophobia, whether you remember those times and whether you see the current times as a kind of continuation. It's responsible for how immune you are to moments of, I will have to say, hysteria, right? I mean, like justified hysteria when you feel completely under existential threat. And you do mention it in your book as well. Can we talk about 9/11 and where were you and how that experience is basically leading to this book? Because it is.
Yeah. Well, I was in college. I was a freshman in college, actually. So I was 2 weeks into my freshman year. I was at Georgetown here in Washington, D.C. And I was trying to figure out who I was and dealing with some identity issues. And it's the first time living away from home. So you really have the freedom to figure out who you want to be. It's really a heady time. But then 9/11 happens and it changes everything for me. It even changes the kinds of things that I wanted to study. Before 9/11, I wanted to just live a normal life. I didn't really have a vision of going into politics or becoming a writer and doing this for my career. But 9/11 politicized me, and I could see the smoke from the Pentagon on the top of my dorm. So being in DC, I mean, people forget that sometimes. I mean, for us, it had a personal element as well, where it was like visually there for us. And so 9/11 was the hinge moment in a lot of ways for me, where I decided that I wanted, that I had something to say and I wanted to say it. And then fast forwarding a little bit to the Iraq War, and I mentioned my involvement in the anti-war movement. What I also realized during that period was that I didn't want to be on the outside looking in. I didn't want to just be a protester. I didn't want to be one of those guys with signs outside of the White House. I really had a sense that power mattered because I was disillusioned after the Iraq War happened because there was a mass mobilization against the war. People throughout the world in capitals, there was this one coordinated day of protest where millions of people were out in the streets. I think a lot of us thought people power would stop the war, but people power didn't stop the war. And I wanted to make sense of that. And one way I made sense of that was by paying attention to how it happened, that there was this group of so-called neocons around George W. Bush who knew each other in grad school, who were ideologically committed, and they were able to capture the levers of the state and remake American policy in their image. And so there was a real lesson there for me that sometimes it's about having, you have to be comfortable with power and you have to actually want power. And this is where someone like Zohran Mamdani, I think, is really inspirational in a lot of ways because he seems like a traditional leftist who wants to be morally pure. But then he's like, I want to be the mayor of the most important city in the world, or the second most important city. Well, actually, probably in some ways, the most important city in the world. Like, that's an
I live
amazing.
here. It's the most important. Okay.
Yeah.
We are the most important people in the world, as everybody knows.
Yeah, right, right. So that to me, like, how do you meld a moral sensibility with a comfort with power, or at least a willingness to wield power? That to me is the real challenge.
And you like him because you don't have to live here, so we will have
Oh yeah, yeah, sorry.
whatever
Yeah.
mess he makes, we will have to clean
You
up.
have to live with his actual policies. I can
Yeah,
just
I'm not
observe from
sure I'm
afar.
about it.
Yeah, yeah.
To kind of close our interview, which has been so fascinating. Thank you so much. And I don't want to go too deeply into like the Obama era, but you do write a little bit about the audacity of hope. right? I apologize to my entire generation for using this phrase, but you see hope as kind of the symbol, the greatest symbol of courage. Because you can be kind of medium courageous, medium brave, and still feel like, oh, there's nothing else to do. Let's give up. Kind of dive into our escapist lives, complain online. And you are like, no, actually, if you're a writer, you have to take sometimes very contrarian positions and follow your, moral code. If you want power to be better, get involved. I think when you're saying people should be more powerful, you're not like calling for more dictatorial behavior. You want people to get active, like enter the realm of power, to add your voice, to add your ethics, your aspirations. So how do you, if somebody wants to be more hopeful, do you think it suffices to actually just try to make them more brave? Are these two things
Yeah, you need to be
connected?
brave for sure. But I think that the reason people need the reason people should be hopeful, even if it doesn't seem like there's much cause for it, is because we still do live in a democracy, however flawed. And what that means is that we have avenues available to us. We can do precisely the things that you're talking about. We can vote, we can organize, we can participate, we can wield power, we can run for office on the local level. Like it's pretty amazing the things that we can do. And again, because knowing what the alternative is, democracy is pretty great in that regard. And I think that we all have a moral responsibility to think carefully about what role we want to play. I mean, do we want to be like a finance bro and just work at an investment bank and make money? Is that really the legacy we want to leave? And a lot of people make those choices that are self-interested, and then they complain about the way their country is turning out to be. So I think it's pretty easy and straightforward at the end, what at least part of what my message is, which is democracy is a kind of trust. And Barack Obama did tap into something really powerful, but it's something that every generation can tap into, which is we are Americans who live in America. And that means that we get the government that we deserve. We get the policies we deserve. So if we don't like how things turn out, there's actually something hopeful about it, because it's sort of like, well, if we really don't like it, then we can resolve to fight 4 years from now through the ballot box. The door is never entirely closed. This idea that there's something final about Donald Trump, that the fact that he's winning now means that America is done for, that means you don't believe in the American project. If America is so weak that it can't survive a second Donald Trump term, then is it even worth fighting for? I mean, come on.
I hope people will take this to heart, because I hear this argument a lot. I mean, of course, having seen what's happening in Hungary, where I'm from originally, of course, there are ways to kind of get rid of the democratic turnover. And some people manage to undo the democratic process. And there are, like, most dictatorships of the past 100 years followed at least some period of democracy and then undid it. So extreme fears can be warranted for people who are excited about extreme fears and being fearful of them. But that's an extreme. That's not a logical outcome that will happen no matter what.
Yeah, but all the more reason to participate. If you're really scared that America is going to become a proper dictatorship, then you better go out there and do something about it, if you really believe your own words. Yeah.
Is that how you check whether somebody is kind of like intellectually serious? Do you have a put your money where your mouth is test for people?
Look, I think it's hard because I think some people just want to live a quiet life. I don't always want to say that if you think that America is falling apart, that you have to dedicate your life to X, Y, and Z. Some people might just make the choice to focus on their family, friends, and community. And there's some use in that too. Like on a lot of these changes, if we want our country to be better, some of it's going to happen on the local level. It's not all national. So I totally respect. I mean, I want to live a quieter life. Do I always want to be involved in politics? Do I always love writing about this stuff? Not always.
Do you have like a secret life where you write anonymous film reviews like Matt Iglesias?
Oh, no, I don't, but I do have a fantasy of writing a novel, and I'm actually quite serious about it. I would like to take a year off in the coming years and just like dedicate myself to fiction because reality is too scary.
For my selfish purposes, this sounds amazing. Please do that if you ever need
And
any.
you encouraged me. I mean, you even said that I could write a good novel.
I think so. I mean, I find this one is more like a manifesto, right? But the problem of democracy is very novelistic,
Hmm.
very particular genre. And I often argue that, the death of journalism is horrible news for literary fiction. Because all you get is like MFA navel gazing, and there's
Hmm.
only so much interest I can muster up for like depressed Brooklyn girl in the laundromat thinking about her mom. Like it's very interesting, but like maybe once. And we don't have these like adventurous political books that journalists could kind of churn out very quickly because you're used to having to write on a deadline. You can't really spend 15 years thinking about your mom at the laundromat, etc., etc. And so I always think that journalists should write novels because you guys tend to be really good at it. You,
Hmm.
you have access to the real world. Most of you can't really afford, being in some kind of ivory tower. And I find that the problem of democracy, because you have all these interviews and all these scenes and characterization and location, it like if you had told me that parts of it were from a novel, I would have been like, sure.
I love hearing that. It's really nice to hear. Thank you.
So
Yeah.
I'm all for all friends, and thank you so much. I mean, but also, your nonfiction, I think, teaches the new generation of writers about intellectual honesty and like thinking what you think based on your own logic and your own morality, and that's the job of the writer. We had Caroline Calloway on, and she said the wisest thing. She was like, "Write like you're already dead."
Oh, yes.
I try to do
Nice.
that. I can't. I really want people to continue calling me and liking me. But if you can do it, you're good. Shadi Hamid, thank you so much for joining us. You always give us more hope. And please write more.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.